One of the guys had worked all night on his video game, and they had a field tested the next afternoon, and they threw it in the back of the pickup, went screaming all the way to
They didn't strap it down.
They didn't strap it down good enough. They went around a corner. The game went over the backside of the truck and smashed into a million pieces.
It was great. They brought back the parts, and they put them back in the lab. And I took a piece of paper and I wrote "failed field test" and slapped it on there. You start out with one idea in mind, and as you're playing it, you may find that people are creating their own game in the way that they play it, or there's one particular part of the game that's more fun than the rest of it. So the game kind of dictates where it should go. I mean, by people's response to it, and they change as they go. It's not like, well, we had this idea and we made it happen just like that. It doesn't happen that way very often.
For example, Tempest started out as first-person Space Invaders,
right.
And I brought it up. We played it. We had a marketing review, and they said, "This is first-person Space Invaders, but it's not much fun. Do you have any ideas, Dave?" And I says, "Well, I got this idea where there's this hole in the ground and there's monsters coming out, and I can make this thing into that hole in the ground nightmare." And so they came back like 2 weeks later, and they said, "This is fun. Let's do this." And that was Tempest.
I had another case too. Centipede was originally all the mushrooms were fixed position. You couldn't shoot them, and there weren't anything to create them. And it was Dan Vanner, a VP, during one of the reviews, said, "Isn't there some way we can, shoot the mushrooms?" Because he wanted to shoot the mushrooms, get them out of the way. And I said, "Well, if I shoot the mushrooms, I'm going to have somebody create them, and probably another person that eats them up, and so on." And that's basically how it came about. All the spider could eat the mushrooms, and anytime you shoot a centipede, it would stick one back, and I would a certain number of shots to get rid of it. And so that's how the game developed. And once I added that, it was suddenly, this is fun.
Well, Tempest started out as first-person Space Invaders. I thought, well, Space Invaders was one of my favorite games, and I thought, well, if I do first-person Space Invaders, that'll be a blast. So I whipped it together and had a marketing review on it, and we all played it, and it was okay, but it wasn't a lot of fun. And so right there at that meeting, we said, well, should we kill it? And I says, well, I've got this other idea that's sort of related. I said, I got this nightmare about this hole in the ground, and there's these monsters from the center of the earth that are trying to get out of the hole, and you have to smash them before they get out of the hole and kill you. And they said, sounds good. Let's try it out. So I basically just took first-person Space Invaders and wrapped the surface into a circle, into a tunnel, and had the monsters coming down the tunnel at you, like coming out of a hole in the ground, and you tried to kill them before they got out. And we had another marketing review on it, and people loved it, and people would come in the lab and play it all the time, and I'd have to shoo them off the machine to work on it. And I knew when that was happening that I had a good thing going. Well, at first I had the levels rotating. So you would turn the knob, and the cylinder would rotate with all the creatures on the cylinder rotating with the cylinder, and it was making people nauseous, which is not a good thing. So we figured, well, what else can we do? We'll just leave the surface stationary and move the objects around on the surface, and that worked just fine. And it was less computationally intensive on top of it, so that solved the nausea problem. Well, it was very simple. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I had these not all the time, but I had a few nightmares about a hole in the earth, and there's these monsters that live inside the earth, and they would come out of the hole, and you had to kill them before they got out, and that's the story. I really get a kick out of seeing people still playing Tempest. Every once in a while, I get email from somebody saying, I spent all my college tuition on playing your game. Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, the whole point of what I did was to let people have a good time and just get away from the frustrations of normal life and just relax, or maybe not relax, maybe just, I guess it's not very relaxing, but just get into another state of mind and forget about all your problems and just blow things up. Tempest hardware has always been a problem. They never really got it working for long periods of time without problems. I remember one time in the lab, my monitor stopped working, and we looked up under the monitor, under the circuit board, and it had gotten so hot and the board was upside down that all, like 4 or 5 of the components had actually desoldered themselves and had fallen out onto the top of the lab. Missile Command, I was working on 4-player soccer, and Steve Calfee, the software manager, called me into his office and said, Dave, we'd like you to, after you finish this game, to work on a new game where the Russians are invading the US, and there's this radar screen and you can see the missiles coming in, and you have to defend the country. And he said, just think about that for your next game. And when I walked out of his office, my spine was just tingling, because I knew that this was like, wow, this is like a great idea. This is going to be great, and it's going to be fun. It was much more complicated to start with. There was going to be a coast specific to wherever the game was located to make it more relevant to who was playing. There was city names. There was railroads supplying the cities from factories, and we actually implemented all that stuff, and so you could blow up the railroads, but it was too complicated. So to make it simple, we got rid of everything except for the cities and the bases, and it turns out that was the right way to do it. Well, the nice thing about that feature was that it gave you a lot more power than just little quick explosions. So one of the important things about timing the game or tuning the game was to get the length of the explosions right, because if they were too quick, you wouldn't have that extra power of the cloud actually blowing up other incoming missiles. The strategy I used in Missile Command was to lay out a pattern of missiles. It would make a cloud across the center of the screen, and the incoming missiles would hit the cloud and blow up and form a secondary cloud. And you could have secondary and tertiary reactions where you could just sit back and watch, sort of like when you play pinball, where you can sit back and watch after you hit the flippers. Well, Missile Command to me was a lot of fun, but it was also a serious matter. And when Atari asked me to do the game, one of the things I said was, this is going to be a totally defensive game. It's not going to be an offensive game. I refused to do something where I had sent off missiles to attack the USSR. So they said fine. So it's a totally defensive game, and to me then it's moral. You're defending your country against attack. But the thought of what actually happens when there's a nuclear attack is terrifying. And working on the game for 6 months, I internalized a lot of the stuff. So I'd have nightmares about nuclear attacks. In my dream I'd see a white streak going across the sky, just like in Missile Command. And I'd be up hiking in the mountains, and I'd see it hit in the valley, like in Sunnyvale. And I'd see the explosion, and I'd know that the blast was going to hit me in like 15 seconds. And I'd wake up in a cold sweat. And this happened quite frequently when I was doing the game, and then it tapered off after the game, but still, I had them for a couple of years afterwards, maybe one every 2-3 months. So it was a sobering experience. Well, one of the things that gave me a rush was seeing Missile Command and Terminator 2, because I love Schwarzenegger's movies, and I love especially his Terminator movies. And to see Missile Command in the second movie was a blast. Missile Command is pretty free of bugs. The only one I know about is that if you get up around 820,000 points, I think it gives you like an infinite number of cities. But no, I don't. There's very few people that can get it up that high. The way I like to work best is when I can really get into it and just sort of you load your mind up with everything that has to be done in that part of your program, and it's hard to get into that state of mind. And once you get there, I hate to leave. So I basically threw out the 24-hour day and would just work until I get so tired I couldn't stay awake anymore, and then go home and sleep, then come back and go to work. But the worst times, or the most intense times, were just before a field test, sometimes when I'd go for 3 or 4 days without any sleep. I remember one time I had a field test on Friday, and I'd been up for 4 days in a row, and I actually got the game ready to go, but I was so tired I couldn't work the machine that burned the ROMs anymore, because I couldn't remember how to punch the buttons on the keyboard. So I had to invite one of my buddies in to work the keys, and I just had to sort of say, okay, you do this, and he worked the buttons for me. Well, that was the whole point of the game, was to show that if there was ever a nuclear war, that you would never win. So that's why there's no end. I was surprised to see how good people got at the games, because in the laboratories, people from the company would come in and play them. We thought, wow, that guy's good. And then we put it out there and have this huge population playing it. And just to see some people that were so good at something, it was like watching the Olympics. The first missile command that we field tested had a huge panel on the top with flashing lights and related to the gameplay.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was about this big, or maybe this big. And we found that it distracted people, because when they're playing the game, they're looking up to try to see these status lights and stuff. So we just chopped off the whole top of the cabinet, saved ourselves a lot of money, and didn't hurt the gameplay any.
Well, the reason I wanted to work on a vector game is because you had much higher resolution. Asteroids had like a 1024 by 768 resolution as compared to a TV screen, which is like 300 by 240, 320 by 240. It's very typical. So you get much better picture qualities. Normally you draw in raster, you get a nice little stair-stepping. When you do it on a vector, it looks like a nice smooth straight line. So it really made it very effective, especially when you're doing small little ships and shots and things like that. You wanted everything to be nice and smooth. All monitors have a problem with screen burn. You see a lot of, like PCs now, they do basically screensavers. Well, in the old days, in Asteroids, we couldn't put a screensaver up there, although we did swap screens around a little bit. But what we did is we had a protection circuit. There's actually a second problem with an XY monitor I should bring up too, and that is if for something should go wrong with the electronics on the board, the monitor's beam would just go down to a single point, and since all that energy is at a single point, it would burn a hole in the screen. So we had special circuitry on there that basically said if you're not drawing far enough apart, then turn off the beam. Well, it turns out that the copyright in the bottom and the scorer and a little bit of stuff at the top was just enough drawing so that it would not erase the screen. And so we found that wasn't quite the case, but there were some monitors that were not quite up to spec with others, and if you had like one rock and the asteroid was, or your spaceship was in the middle, the screen would sort of fade away to black, and as everything moved away, it would come back to bright again. Well, if you're the second player on the other side of the screen, because your screen is now upside down, instead of shrinking it this way, I shrank it this way, so his area got bigger. And of course, he was much easier to hunt. And there are several strategies in Centipede where you simply do nothing but hunt the spider. But the spider also takes care of mushrooms, and there was another strategy called blob strategy, that you try to keep a blob of mushrooms just above the area, and that destroyed that strategy completely. So it turned out to be an interesting feature, but it was certainly a bug that I was not aware of. I actually tried the lurk strategy, getting down to a couple rocks and then trying to shoot the guys, but I just couldn't do it, and I said, nah, nobody else can do it. And just left it the way it was, and it turned out that, of course, people could master it. In fact, they got to the point where they could master it so well that they could build up hundreds of lives. But, and this is not a bug. The hardware has a protection in it that you don't come back to it every so often. It's called a watchdog reset, and it resets the board, starts all over from scratch. But if I spend all this time drawing all the ships across the screen, all your extra lives, it basically runs out of time and causes a reset. So if the guy builds up too many extra lives, of course the board would reset. And it turns out I met my wife, and she had an Asteroids game as well. So we actually have two Asteroids games at home. Wow. One is hers and one's mine. He introduced me to it and basically introduced me as, here's the best video game designer in the world, And she was impressed because she always liked Asteroids. But we started dating about probably 7 months later, 8 months later, and we're married now. And he came back and said, hey, I think there's a bug in your program. I stuck my name and my initials in and it didn't show up. And so we let it go on for a day or two, finally told him. There's an interesting story about the grasshopper and centipede. I've actually received letters, people from players saying, hey, there's a centipede in the graphics, there's a grasshopper in centipede's graphics, where does it show up? How do I get it? And actually, the grasshopper was done initially because it was supposed to hop out, like the spider, and try to hop where you were. because I was afraid people would stay in a particular spot and just, hide in a little corner and stay there. Well, it turns out with the spider's algorithm, there really is no safe spot, and you really do have to move around a lot. And so I never bothered to implement, or actually, I left out the grasshopper's algorithm, but I left the graphics in there, just for the purpose of entertaining somebody who's actually going out looking for something secret. At one point, year after year, we've done the same thing at brainstorming sessions. Our VP of marketing got up and said, "Okay, guys, absolutely no more turtles. No more turtles. Absolutely no more turtles." And so later in the brainstorm, we had one of the waiters bring up a drink for him because he was thirsty. And we got one of these little wind-up turtles. We stuck it in the drink, and so it goes plop, 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 plop. We handed it up to him, and he just takes the glass, and there's splash, splash, splash. Everybody's breaking out and laughing. Turtleroids, that was another joke. So what I did was I took asteroids, and I replaced the small and large saucers with turtles. And so, we had the golden edition out in the lobby of Atari. And so I went in and swapped the game proms, and they had these turtles floating around. And so one day he walked in, looked, and sure enough, there are turtles there. The original Centipede game was from a brainstorming idea called Bug Shooter. And other than shooting bugs, that's really all I had in mind. I was not going to go through any elaborate storyline about you're off in Never Never World and it's inhabited with a bunch of bugs, and if you shoot them all and then you get the princess back or anything. Originally it was supposed to be the Atari insignia, which is the two things and the bow in the middle. And the lawyers came back and said, "Up, looks too much like the Atari logo, and the fact that you shoot that center thing out, that kills our trademark. Can't do that." Okay, so I changed it a little bit.
Battlezone actually came about through the brainstorming sessions that we had off-site during that time. Howard Delman had developed a pretty powerful vector generator to do vector-based graphics, and one of the thrusts for that brainstorming session was to do a first-person 3D or multiple first-person 3D based games, and Battlezone was one of the concepts that came out of that brainstorming session. It really wasn't the U.S. Army. It was a group of consultants that were trying to develop an inexpensive training device for the Bradley fighting vehicles, this outside consultant group, which consisted of a lot of ex-Army generals, came and contacted people here at Atari and said, "Can you do a custom version of Battlezone that will specifically train for this new vehicle we have?" And they decided we could do that. One of the people here had taken it on as his project, and basically got me assigned to do it. And I don't have particularly fond memories of it. I lost like 3.5 months of my life living here constantly trying to meet a deadline that they had set up based on a worldwide conference that Army TRADOC was having by satellite. So in order to get this done, we were working here around the clock, weekends. Literally, I rarely saw my wife. We actually copied the controller from the gunner's control in the fighting vehicle, and in fact that controller was the basis for the controller used in Star Wars and many other Atari games from that point on. The demo unit was finished, and then I don't know all the reasons. Like as I said, I was as anxious as possible to get off of it. I said I would do the prototype if I didn't have anything to do with any production plans, and they made that assurance to me, and then there turned out to be no production plans, and I don't know whether it was Atari. I believe it was Atari that decided they didn't want to get into that business, which I think was probably a wise decision. There's at least one prototype existing in the world. The brainstorming sessions really reflected a lot of the culture that went on at Atari at that time, and it was really nice. People were encouraged to submit ideas and not be critical of other people's ideas, but to take them and run with them. Eventually, they became more. People became more and more prepared. They were less extemporaneous than they were in the early days, but it was really a hotbed of creativity. We had a number of extremely creative as well as technically proficient people at Atari, and it was just a wonderful time to be around all that good energy and all of that creativity. You cannot get to the volcano in Battlezone. The whole idea with Volcano and Battlezone We wanted to have some background that was basically like a cylinder of wallpaper that you could never get to, that traveled with you. And Roger Hector, drew this up in vectors for us, and he decided to put in a volcano. And so the volcano was in there, and it was just, paper in the background. I mean, it didn't do anything. And Owen Rubin, who was one of my lab mates at the time, every day would come into the lab and say, when are you going to make the volcano active? When are you going to make the volcano active? And I was busy trying to make a game. I wasn't trying to make the volcano active. And finally I said, look, you program the code and I'll put it in. We'll make the volcano active. Showed up at work the next day, and there it was on my chair in front of my station. And he had written the code, and I plugged it in, and sure enough, we have an active volcano because of that. Oh, one of the engineers was working on a new PC board, and so one of the guys decided, to pull a little prank on him. And after Dave had gone home, this other gentleman, who shall remain nameless, wired up a flash bulb, a flash cube, to the bottom side of the board, hooking it up to plus 12 in ground, so that the next morning when Dave came in and plugged his board in, he got this huge flash and puff of smoke out from the bottom of his board, and caused immediate panic. One way you can really tell that a game is exciting, a game is going to be successful, is if people are playing it in the lab. Ed was constantly having to kick people, and in particular Owen Rubin, off of his asteroid station so that he could work on it. And so Owen would stay late at night, and he would fill up the high score table with his initials. And everybody was getting tired of this, so Ed put in some code to check for all the variations of Owen Rubin's initials, and whenever he would put it would put in Ed's initials instead. I get email from people who found me on the web or somehow or another and found out an address, and they tell me how much they enjoyed the game, and it feels great. Well beyond any money that might have been made, and believe me, it wasn't that much. To just to have people know that people had some fun, and enjoyed something you did, that you created, is one of the best feelings in the world. I think one of the really wonderful things about having been at Atari during that period of time of the late 70s, early 80s was the people that worked there, the entire group of people, and not just as individuals, but we not only worked together, but we socialized together, we played together. It was a real camaraderie that I've never seen quite duplicated to that extent anywhere else.
For me, the most important was field test, where you can walk up, and if the kid puts his money in, sort of gets frustrated, but puts his money back in again, that's okay. I got it.
When they had to put a sign on your game that said maximum two plays per person, then you knew you had a hit.
That's right.
Yeah. You'd kill yourself to get your game ready for the field test. Yeah. I mean, you'd work around the clock, sometimes 4 days in a row without sleeping.
And when those results would come in, it was, it
was worth it. Yeah.
It's like you'd look at them, and if they were good, it was like, wow, this is the best feeling in the world. And if they were not so good, what can I do?
It's also interesting to go to a field test and find all your competitors there checking out your product.
Yep.
That was always a good sign too. Well, it's a good and bad sign. That means they know about it. They know where you're testing, which is bad. But the other part is they're so interested in your game, they're out there taking pictures, videotapes, and sending them back to their headquarters.
There was only one bug in Tempest, and it wasn't actually it was a bug. We designed security into all the games to prevent the foreign companies from ripping them off. There was garage operations in the Far East where they would take our games and remove all the Atari copyrights and logos and put their own stuff in and then sell them as their own games. So I had protection in Tempest that checked to make sure Atari was on the screen in certain positions. Well, right before I shipped Tempest, I tweaked some of the positions on the screens to make sure that everything was perfectly symmetrical. And I forgot to change one of the checks on that position. And the copy protection then went in and detected that this thing was a little off and set up a time bomb that happened 10 minutes later. Well, and this only happened if your score was between 170,000 and like 190,000. So after it was out in the field for a couple of weeks, we started getting reports that people were getting 40 free credits. And I kept saying, no, it's a hardware problem or something. Well, the hardware analyzer actually caught it in the act of me giving the player 40 credits. And it turns out that I was using the tens digit as the location in RAM at which to store a 40 if the Atari wasn't on the screen in the right position. So that spread around, and pretty soon expert players were getting 40 free credits just by nailing the score.